Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Skift Meetings podcast. Today, we are talking about politics and, in particular, what the upcoming US presidential election, how that can impact the meetings industry. With me today, I have my two colleagues on the Skift Meetings editorial team, Andrea Doyle, the executive editor of Skift Meetings, and of course, Barbara Scofidio, who is now celebrating a week and a half as our new editor on the Skift Meetings team.
Hey there, it's Seth Borko, the head of Skift Research, and I've got a brand new report that I want to share with you today. It's called our State of Travel 2024 report. It's perhaps the single most comprehensive report we do every year, and the best part, it's free to download right now. We have 350 plus insights in this report with pretty much a chart for basically any sector. Do you need a chart on hotels? We've got that. A chart on airlines? We've got it. A chart on consumer behavior? Guess what? We've got that too. I really appreciate if you check out our State of Travel report. You can download it now by going to skift.com/state of travel with dashes between every word. So that's skift.com/state-of-travel. Download the report, check it out, and let me know what you think. I hope you enjoy.
Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation because it has been a pretty exciting time in the U.S.
Absolutely. Barbara, welcome.
Well, thank you. And I'm thrilled to be here and jumping into my first podcast with you.
Excellent. So, just a disclaimer at the start of this podcast that we are not political analysts. This is something that we're following with close attention, but we're not political analysts. And really, the point of this conversation is to talk about the potential impacts of either party coming out on top at the elections to the meetings industry and how we see it potentially impacting. So there's a lot of potential in this conversation. We don't know any of these things for sure, but I think it's a great time to talk about this, particularly because today is the last day of the Democratic National Convention, the DNC, happening in Chicago. It's been happening the last 3 days. We're recording this on the last day. So there's a lot of news. There's a lot of new details that are coming in. And so we're hopefully going to capture those a little bit in this conversation. Before we jump in, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Don't forget to follow or subscribe this podcast wherever you're listening and watching. And if you're enjoying the show, please rate us 5 stars, leave us a positive review so we can get out the news about the Skift Meetings podcast. And of course, if you have a moment, why not share it with a friend or colleague? Thank you very much for listening, and let's jump in. First of all, I'd like to start with a topic that we've talked about quite a bit. We've covered quite a bit on Skift Meetings, which is really this idea of challenges in Florida and other states across the US that have what we've been calling divisive laws. And if a Trump presidency in particular could have further negative impacts. We've covered this quite a bit in terms of travel bans, in terms of conferences pulling out, and Florida is a state that we've covered quite a bit, but there are other states. And I'll jump to Andrea because I know that you've covered this topic quite a bit. What are your thoughts on this matter? And I know this covers a lot of different areas, but I'll start with the divisive laws as a kickstarting point.
So we've written many stories over the past 2 years about how Donald Trump's administration, which didn't encompass rights for all LGBTQ people, impacted meetings. So like you said, in Florida, there were so many travel advisories in place, which impacted groups because some groups don't want to meet in destinations with political views that do not align with their political views. But then after Roe versus Wade was overturned, it seemed that every state has an issue. So in a way, it levels a playing field. But people don't want to meet in destinations that don't align with their values. And what was interesting to me is, like Destinations International has done quite a lot of research that shows boycotts hurt frontline workers. And those are the people you don't want to hurt. So there's several organizations that have come on board that can help. One that we covered was Social Offset. So meet in the destination that has political views that may not align with yours, but then raise money for nonprofits that do align with your political views. So that was a long-winded question saying, I have a long-winded answer saying that, Donald Trump's administration isn't going to be as encompassing for LGBTQ rights as a Kamala Harris administration would be.
So I have a couple of things to add from the meeting professional perspective. Your audience might not be aware that I've spent the past probably 12 years actually as a meeting planner part time. I toggled between editor and meeting planner, and have faced a lot of this firsthand that you guys are facing. First of all, I want to say social offset is brilliant because associations can be made or broken by the attendance at their events, those annual conventions. And I've written about this as well, with CEOs of associations pleading, they're sending letters to their attendees to please attend. And here's what we're doing to, if you will, offset this decision. And it really has worked in many cases. Going back to the especially the Florida thing, because we did a lot of events in Florida. I regularly got emails from men and women. This affects the attendees in a big way, and saying flat out, I would love to attend. I cannot attend because I do not feel safe. And please let me know when you're doing a meeting somewhere else. And that's just the reality that I've experienced. So I wanted to share.
But it was interesting because I attended Destinations International a few weeks ago, and that was held in Tampa. So Florida is a state with a lot of divisive laws in place, and they decided to go ahead with their annual meeting. With that in mind, they brought in Jane Castor, who is the mayor of Tampa. She's one of 37 openly LGBTQ mayors. She addressed the group. She was so inspirational. They had all local craftspeople selling their wares. A lot of them were diversity owned businesses. So, polarization sucks. There's no doubt about it, but there's ways to work around it and have meetings and events successfully in destinations that do not have political values that align with your groups.
Those are all great stories, and it's very smart of them. And the reality is that I've used dozens of Florida resorts for events. They know the industry inside out. They are, just so meeting friendly, so lovely to work with. You can't just write all that off. You find a way to balance your destination decision. And I think anywhere that you meet, we're going a little off the topic, but you want to support the local community and love the
Right.
craft, the local artisans and local food and all of that. I mean, we're here to support the communities where we work.
And no matter who wins this presidential election, I just hope that the country comes together because there really is too much polarization.
Agreed.
But then, like our colleague DeWitt yesterday wrote a story about Visit Florida taking its LGBTQT page off its website. That doesn't do anything to bring us together. So my hope is just that we could have some more unity in this country.
Yep. I recall having Elena Gesterman, one of the co-founders of Social Offset, at our Destination Experience Summit, and she talked about from the Informs perspective. She's the executive director of Informs, a very large association, how much of a mess it was in the boardroom when they were thinking about which destinations to go for their meetings. And she candidly just explained it was tricky, it was messy, and I think that's kind of what we're dealing with. And I think what you're both saying, and I this is why I'm playing the role of moderator in this conversation, because I'm not based in the US. I don't get a say in this election, and so I really want to hear from you. What you're hearing and what you're feeling as well. But I think this concept of polarization is challenging, right? And it feels like I think it's fair to say that both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are polarizing. And you could argue easily that Republicans and Trump especially has a more polarizing view on a lot of things. But from what I heard of the DNC yesterday, there are also attempts at unity, but there are also contrasts between the two policies and the kind of directions. So polarization is tough. It feels like polarization is almost a marketing technique that I think both parties are using. And so I think the unity message is a great one, but it's a very hard one to put into practice when you're talking about politics, because it really is a vote for one or vote for the other, right?
Absolutely.
If I could add one, and I'm not going to go into it in depth, but we can't leave it out. Obviously, it's one of the key issues in this race, and that is women's reproductive rights. And that has an impact on meeting professionals. And I have been in rooms where we finally sit down and talk about this. And planners are concerned about attendees in certain states who are pregnant, who come to their meeting. And what if something happened while they were there medically? Would they get the treatment they want? So, or they not want, that they need. And just want to bring it up because it is being discussed. It is a concern, and it's not something we have an answer to. I know individual travelers are deciding. I know for a fact because I know some not to fly to certain places. That's huge. So these changes are real, and they do impact our role.
I mean, it just, as a mom of two daughters, it just makes me so sad that this happened and that this is such a big issue of this political race, because you know what? These decisions are between a person and their God. The government has no place in a woman's bedroom, in a woman's decision. So this is such a big, big issue of this political campaign.
Yep.
And I mean, it is exciting to see Kamala as the presidential nominee, the first woman of color. I mean, it's exciting. So
It's exciting, and you know what? It could make or break this election. This issue could make or break. It certainly
oh,
has
absolutely.
a huge impact on the midterms. So we'll see, but just stay tuned.
I mean, we're about to publish a story about the first night of the DNC and how it went over from a time aspect, but the energy in that room and just their use of music, and it's such a celebration. I think meeting professionals can learn a whole lot about. I know we're getting away from politics, but I just think it has been such an amazing production. I mean, I'm sobbing every night watching this.
It's very good at bringing out the emotions, and there is a lot of just chit chat on different meeting industry groups about the production and how well done it has been. So
And then interesting too to bring in musical stars like Beyonce allowed Kamala's to use that song "Freedom," which gives me the goosebumps every time I hear it.
Definitely an interesting case for production. I think all these conventions are very interesting. The political conventions. I think also going back to sort of the pandemic thoughts about hybrid meetings. I think this is really interesting because they're very separate audiences when you think about the production of the DNC, right? You have the on-air audience, the ones most of the people viewing at home, and then you have the people in the room. And while that's nothing new for live TV, this idea that the energy in the room and the production can sort of shift so much, and people are late, and depending on the response they get, they might be allowed on stage a bit longer. There's a lot of changes that aren't normally part of live TV, right? Live TV is very coordinated, very structured, and it's very hard to manage that. So it's not like a sports game, but it almost is a sports game as well as a concert. There's lots of angles to this that make it a very interesting production.
And if you think about it, one of the biggest changes was last night was supposed to be when Kamala accepted the VP nomination, but instead you have Tim Walz, and now she'll be making her big speech tonight. So talk about an election that you don't know what's coming next. I mean, it seems like it was so long ago, but to think about the fact that there was a shooting at a Trump rally, I mean, this election will go down as being unprecedented on so many levels.
Let's get back to the matter at hand. I think we've gone off topic slightly, but obviously within the realm of politics and the realm of what we're seeing right now. Now, one area that Skift has covered on skift.com is this idea that Brand USA, the entity that's responsible for promoting the US as a destination for tourism, but also for meetings and events, may be in danger of having their funding removed because during the Trump administration, its funding was cut, and they essentially had to fight to get their funding confirmed and to remain as an entity. And their funding is up for renewal in 2027, which is not that long from now. And so, if we are going to see a Trump administration for the next 4 years, that could be an issue. And I think not just Brand USA, but I think that has a potential of impacting all destinations, right? Because many destinations depend on either public funding or just the public will to have that kind of the funding. That you have the tax districts, right, that kind of get taxes from hotel rooms, etc., to fund these destination organizations, and that's challenging. I don't know if either of you have any comments on that, but I think depending on which direction this election goes, there could be some real struggles for organizations that have a lot of funding or that normally have a lot of promotional activity that may go silent. And I wonder if there's going to be a big difference depending on who becomes president. I think that's probably the main point there. No thoughts on that. Let's move on to a next point, which I think is kind of interesting, which is the junk fee disclosure. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Junk fees ruling that's coming down, that's in effect, or it's kind of being put into place right now. This idea that particularly resort fees, I think, are the big topic within meetings and events. If resort fees become by law kind of part of the hotel rate and any other kind of hotel fees, could that have a big issue on meetings and events? Barbara, you've been working, you said part-time as a meeting planner. I know that when people, look up fees or hotel rates to come to an event, when that resort fee of, anything from $15 to $75 is sort of hidden and not made public, that could cause a real surprise. And that can actually make meetings a lot more expensive to organize. Is that going to be an issue?
It goes so beyond resort fees. We had an advisory board meeting, and people were cracking up because they use the term plus, plus plus plus. It's the rate, but it's plus plus plus. But it's really not funny. I actually, for this podcast, pulled together a few of the fees that this group of meeting professionals were seeing. I'm just going to read them to you because some of them are unbelievable. There was a water fee in Cape Cod. They're seeing fuel surcharges of 8 to 12% on their bill, even though fuel costs, we all know, have come down. There are still COVID-related health and safety charges in effect, even though we're not doing anything anymore as far as protection from COVID. Mandatory gratuities for hotel housekeeping. That's a whole issue in itself because a lot of housekeeping is being outsourced. There are literally apps now where you kind of like Uber, on-demand housekeeping. Housekeepers sign up for certain properties and work for them. But gratuities have never been mandatory in that case. The other huge one is convenience fees from credit card companies. They're already charging whatever incredibly exorbitant rate they're charging, and now they're charging convenience fees just to process the bill. And admin fees, all these sneaky, at restaurants, admin fees. So to answer you, it's gotten completely out of control. It makes it extremely hard to budget because every hotel has different fees. And there is only so much you can do to negotiate because it is still very, very much a seller's market. I know we were talking about the other day, is that shifting? But I mean, what I'm hearing is they are still completely in control and they just say no. So.
Are you tired of sifting through endless resumes looking for the perfect candidate to fill a leadership opening? Skift Executive Search can help. We have an insider view of the travel industry and can leverage both our expertise and connections to find your next rockstar hire. To learn more, visit skift.com/exec-search or email us at execsearch@skift.com.
Skift Meetings ran a story about junk fees in California a few weeks ago, and all the meeting professionals I interviewed for the story were looking forward to having a state where everything is upfront. Because how do you compare? It's not comparing apples to apples.
Absolutely.
Coming into my European perspective, it's something I always talk about a lot as well. I think this is something that's much more regulated in most places in Europe, and so when you see a rate for a meeting room or a hotel in Europe, it is exactly what you pay. There is no added, even state tax or anything like that. That's already included, and so sometimes it's quite hard to compare prices in the U.S. with the rest of the world. I think particularly for international planners, just make sure you keep that in mind because it is a lot of times, at least in my experience, it is the final rate. The thing that you're actually going to pay is what you're quoted, which is quite different.
And
But I did,
these fees also impact airfare.
Right.
yes.
I
Yeah.
remember once, Miguel, you showed us your receipt from your airfare and it was like plus, 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 plus.
Yeah, and I think with airfares, there's that idea, like you said, the fuel surcharges, all these things. You do see the final price, but if you look into all the surcharges that are included in airfare, I think the last one I counted had 12 different surcharges in it. Right? There's an airport surcharge and a security surcharge and all these things, and it all feels quite kind of. I guess it's interesting to understand where the money is going to, or how that price of the ticket is feeding through. But when you get surprise surcharges, like you were saying, I think that's the biggest issue. But I think we're seeing this. Are we seeing this as a Democrat versus Republican? Because I think that's the fight that's going on, right? There's also another one route, which is the refunds from airlines, right? The automatic airline cash refunds. So if something goes wrong with your flight, you automatically get a cash refund. And I believe this is being supported by the Democratic side of the world, and the Republican side fighting it, saying that it's not fair, it's not right, the regulation isn't quite complete. I'm not suggesting that this is right or wrong, but it does feel like that's the challenge here, right? There's a sort of push from the Democratic side to have more public, more open and clear kind of structure of fees, and this idea that you could get refunds very quickly, and the Republican side being a little bit against this. Any thoughts on this immediate cash refund? I think that's going to be an interesting one.
Well,
Well,
go
go
ahead.
on, Barbara, you go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, I just went through this. And the big thing is, if it's weather related, it's not relevant. Well, that is something the airlines, are using and can use to avoid this. And weather stretches from up the whole East Coast. If there's a problem in Boston, but you're down in, New York, and Logan's not letting you
That's an
in.
interesting point. It's probably should be part of this discussion to regulate what can be considered weather, perhaps,
Right.
right? Because as you say, an airline can say, "Hey, there was weather in Texas that affected the
Can't do
plane
it.
that was coming in that was going to connect in Florida or whatever." And yeah, I don't know if that's part of the regulation, but that's a really interesting point.
And regarding the whole issue of hidden fees, there was good news. In June, the US House of Representatives passed the No Hidden Fees Act in a bipartisan vote. So that was really good news.
Right. And the American Hotel and Lodging Association's really pushing that. So that is very good news. We've just got to get it's kind of gotten out of control. It's like a post-COVID phenomenon, like so many other things. Like, when you go to the supermarket and containers are smaller than they used to be for the things that you buy, and somehow these things are happening and they're spiraling out of control since COVID, right? It's got to get it under control. So I'm eager to hear what happens.
So, what about climate change? Not suggesting that either party has a solution to climate change, but I think that there are very different approaches to climate change. And we've covered climate change quite a lot. We've covered climate events, how climate is impacting events. And I guess what I'm really asking is how are these kind of different approaches to climate change? Will they impact anything in terms of meetings? Because we are seeing increased cancellations. We're seeing a lot of issues with festivals. And in general, I think the Democrats have a much more proactive approach to climate change, or are much more willing to talk about sustainability and put measures into place, whilst the Republican policies tend to be more protective of businesses and about long-term strategies?
Well, if former President Trump is reelected, I feel we need to prepare for less environmental regulations. Um, he relaxed climate rules during his first term, which included weakening standards on air and water quality, reducing restrictions on fossil fuel production, and changing rules designed to limit pollution. So, as far as the environment is concerned, if it is a Trump presidency, standards are going to go down.
But how does that impact meetings, do we think?
It does. I'll give you an example. I was at a Caesars event in Las Vegas, and it was hotter in Las Vegas than it ever was before. So the planners behind this wellness summit had to scramble and bring events inside. They had to add more misters. So so many meetings and events are impacted by the climate change.
I am happy to share a war story around hurricanes. And we cannot deny, I mean, it's factual that there are more hurricanes. They're starting sooner, they're more powerful. The Gulf water is 90 degrees. It's like a breeding ground for hurricanes. So literally, well, it was August 7th. So it was very recently. I held a meeting in Charlotte Harbor, Florida, West Coast, the beautiful Sunseeker Resort. And it was right when Hurricane Debbie was becoming a hurricane. And I can't tell you the stress around the decision to hold that meeting or not. DeSantis had already created a state of emergency in Florida, so force majeure probably would have applied. I had to. One big thing I will say is that the communications from the hotel were incredible. I communicated to people. On Friday, it was not a hurricane, it was a tropical storm. I sent a communication that we were going to be watching it over the weekend. On Monday, we decided that we should go because it had already passed and it was heading toward hitting Big Bend. It had turned into a hurricane and we decided to go. I'm not going to go on and on about it. Meeting planners will relate, but I had my keynote speaker in New York who, this went all the way up the East Coast. She's in New York, cannot get to the meeting. She, the next day, drove herself to DC or took the train to DC, flew to Fort Lauderdale, and drove over to us to be able to speak on the second day instead of the first. I had communications from planners who were attending. Some of them were kind of like, do you realize there's a hurricane going on? Because it was going up the East Coast. I ended up with pretty much everyone attending, other than this keynote who had trouble. But what a tough call. And this is what planners are going to be dealing with more and more. That's the reality. And no matter what you do, you cancel, you have challenges, you go forward. You could have fewer attendees. For example, the outlets at the hotel were not open because there was a hurricane a couple of days before. They literally opened the day of our meeting, reopened. Things like that are a planner nightmare and very real.
Yep.
And as a result of this, having an indoor space or a plan B is no longer a nice to have, it's a must have.
Good point.
How was your plan B for your event there, Barbara? Did you have a plan B if there was a hurricane?
Did I have a plan B? I was told we're going. It was a absolute must go. We had people, all kinds of reasons to move forward, and timing. We just were really lucky that time.
And we recently had Melinda Burdett from MPI on our podcast, and she explained during an event she had in Las Vegas, she set up cooling rooms. They just were rooms for people for the opening reception was held around the pool. And even that late in the evening, it was still over 100 degrees. So they had rooms set up where people could cool off.
Yep.
Yeah. Wow.
Now, climate change is a tricky topic because, policies can only change so much. But I'd like to talk about a topic that's a little bit closer, a little bit more direct, I think, in terms of the political stance of the country, which is visas, and really this idea of attracting or welcoming international travelers to the US. The U.S. experienced incredibly long visa delays. Some places, close to 2 years of wait to get a visa. There's been a lot of efforts now to put in place to kind of speed that up, but I would hazard a thought that a Trump administration will probably not prioritize visas and delays around visas as much as a Harris administration. Thoughts on that in terms of what difference that makes for the perception of the U.S. and for, I guess, the availability of the U.S. as a destination for international meetings.
Well, it's 100% impacting the events industry because if you look at the statistics, international attendees aren't where they were before COVID. So we're still not back from an international perspective. And, you know, if Donald Trump becomes president, it's important to realize the first Trump administration put on a hiring freeze of visa processing staff. So that's just going to complicate matters.
Yeah, and also that first administration had travel bans that have since been revoked, right? So you had a number of countries that just couldn't travel to the U.S. Again, in practice, I don't know how many people were blocked from coming to events. I'm sure a few, but I don't know how significant that was. But I think as someone outside the U.S., that always sends a very mixed message, right? When you're banning people from certain countries, then it's tough to feel welcome when you're traveling internationally into the US. And I think that could have a very negative impact.
And Trump has said at rallies numerous times that if he is elected, he will bring travel bans back even bigger than they were before. So that's concerning.
Right. The travel ban piece, he's been very clear on. I mean, I do want to say there's been a lot of good news coming out of the ECA and their efforts. Legislative action day took place at the end of May. There were 110 meetings, and the only two priorities visas were one of them. So they rallied and they lobbied. One of the people who was in attendance there, I actually wrote down a quote about what she said about visas, but she's from an association, the Society of Women Engineers, and she was saying that members from Africa, especially Nigeria, are just having a hard time obtaining visas to attend her events in the U.S. But they're having an easier time coming to Germany for their events. And she said the U.S. has is losing its competitive edge or will if this issue persists. So it's very real.
Barb, I was in DC and was part of the New Jersey group that went to talk with our politicians about the importance of this. And everyone we talked to was understood how important it is.
Yeah.
It is a big issue. So I want to come to the final topic that I'd like to cover, which is investment in infrastructure. And this is something that is very hypothetical, as much of this episode really is. But we're seeing a number of cities in the U.S. with quite large improvements on convention centers. We have the convention center in Austin, for example, that's going to close for, I think, around 3 years to kind of have a very significant rebuild. So there is a lot of investment in structures and buildings, particularly focused on meetings and events. And I just wondered if you had any ideas or thoughts on how, again, the Harris or Trump administration will impact this. Is the kind of Republican view on the world more, I guess, focused on private investment? Is that going to actually be helpful in this stance in terms of getting more convention centers up and running?
Well, I mean, I kind of am taking it, and that's an important issue, but a huge issue living on the northeast corridor of the U.S. is the transportation issue. So, I mean, it's like a two-sided thing. And I mean, we cannot ignore this enormous $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed in 21, which addresses a big part of what it addresses is rail travel. It's the largest investment since the creation of Amtrak. And it's, look at China. It's got 22,000 miles of high-speed rail. We need this investment for our events. We need this investment in these corridors, and so this bill is contributing greatly to that. Maybe, Andrea, do you have something to share on the convention center side of things?
Well, the Republican convention was held in Milwaukee, and Milwaukee unveiled their new center during that. So convention centers bring business. They make a huge economic impact.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, and going back to your point, Barbara, I think you have Brightline. I think the train that's operating now in Florida, right?
Look at what it's done to Florida. Absolutely.
That's
And
big.
that Kamala Harris was a huge, part of that bill being passed, obviously. So you can only look forward and
Absolutely.
again, we're making assumptions, but she and Joe Biden were really, really that's a significant bill. And we're seeing evidence. I don't know what it's like where you live, Andrea, but I'm actually outside of Boston, and there are signs up. There's construction on roads, and a lot of evidence of that bill and the impact.
Absolutely.
Not to say anything about the incredible things it's doing around, Wi-Fi, like internet for everyone, lead pipes, replacing lead pipes, really important infrastructure improvements that need to be made for the people of this country. So,
Well, look forward to seeing what happens with all these different points. We'll know the results of the election in November, and then we can track back maybe in a year or two and see if our thoughts and predictions made any sense. I think it's so unpredictable in terms of which points get pushed on, which things get discussed, and which laws get approved. So, Andrea, Barbara, thank you so much for covering with us on this journey into what does it mean for a Harris or a Trump administration. I think we really don't know what the future holds, but it's interesting to look at these different aspects and how politics in the US can really impact this. And don't forget, we're going to be covering this in more detail at the Skift Meetings Forum. We have Mike Dominguez, the CEO of Alhai, and Senthil Gopinath, the CEO of ICA, offering two very different views, two very different worldviews, not just on the political situation in the US, but also let's not forget there are elections. This is a major election year across the world. I think there's something like 2 billion people voting this year. Almost half of the world is voting. So it'll be very interesting to understand the outcomes of that and how that impacts our particular industry. So thank you for joining me in this hypothetical conversation about politics in the US. And I hope that we can keep covering this topic objectively and really figure out the ups and downs of this for the meetings industry. So thank you both for joining me today.
And the most important thing is everyone needs to get out and vote.
go vote.
Yes, no matter which direction you vote, the most important thing is to vote, right? Be informed and vote.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey there. If you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, please make sure to subscribe, rate us 5 stars, or leave us a positive review. That really helps us get out the word about the Skift Meetings podcast and make sure that we can continue to bring you this podcast every week absolutely free of charge. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the Skift channel and hit the notification bell to find out whenever a new video drops.
With more than 50 articles per week, exclusive feature stories twice a month, live events, podcasts, reports, and more, Skift is the source for global travel industry news. See what we've been up to at skift.com and stay ahead with the latest insights and trends shaping the future of travel.